Good morning to those of you who are chiming in from the U.S. Good evening if you are from Asia. Welcome to the Stimson webinar on the Nippon Steel U.S. Steel agreement or partnership, whatever you would like to call it. And we're going to discuss it in just a few minutes. But I will let everyone log on first and give a few more minutes. So we'll start going in just a couple of minutes. Thank you. All right. I think I'm sure there are other people who are trickling in as we go, but since we only have an hour, I will start. Again, welcome to everyone. For those of you who are logging on in the United States, good morning. For those of you who are coming in from Asia, good evening. My name is Yuki Tatsumi. I'm a co-director of the East Asia Program and director of Japan Program at Stimson Center. This morning, I have a very interesting topic, lots of things to discuss, and I'm very, very grateful for the two panelists whom I'm going to introduce in just a minute to join me in discussing the very timely topic. As many of you know, President Trump surprised all of us with a surprise announcement that he will give a soft green light to allow U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel to proceed with their partnership. But there are a lot to unpack. He has been kind of vague on the details and what it would look like. We know what he had said about partnership, investment, etc. But what else is there, and what are the next steps? So, joining me in this morning's conversation is Honorable Jeff Bialos and Dr. Sarah Burrell-Dansman. Honorable Bialos, he's actually a revered member of the Stimson's board, but more importantly, he has served as many senior level positions in the past administration, most prominently as a Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Industrial Affairs. But he also has touched on the business side as when he was serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Commerce on the handling the export control issues. Dr. Burrell-Dansman is the foremost one of the foremost experts on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, which is quite mouthful, but they are going to unpack all of these. She is currently a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, but also has a full-time teaching position at Indiana University. So she is, sounds like she's spending a lot of time crisscrossing the country. So thank you, Sarah, for joining us for this very last minute. Obviously, announcement itself was last minute. So there's nothing much we could do about that. But I think how we're going to do is Jeff has a couple of slides that he would like to share with us very quickly to set us off. And then he will engage Sarah with the conversation about the specific issues that the slide will have covered. And then we will open it up to questions and answers. So with that, if we can start sharing the slides, that'll be great.
Thanks, Yuki, and glad to be here with you and with Sarah. One other thing I'll note is around the same time in the speech in Pittsburgh talking about the U.S. Steel Nippon steel deal, the president also announced that the tariffs under Section 232 on steel that had been at 25% would be doubled to 50%. And it's not an unrelated topic, and we thought we would bring that into the discussion of is steel a national security issue here. So, Vanessa, if you could flip to the next slide. Just to set this up and by way of context, what are the standards for these things? Well, CFIUS reviews foreign investments to look at does the proposed acquisition of a U.S. business, quote, threaten to impair national security? It doesn't have to impair it, it has to threaten to impair it. And it's national security, not anything else, not economic security, not national interest. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, which came first, is similar standard. Is an article being imported in such quantities or other circumstances so as to threaten to impair national security. Again, same language, threaten to impair national security, not any other kind of security. Those are the standards for this. And I think it serves as a basis for the conversation. Next slide, please. Just by way of context on the Steel 232, prior to Trump 1, there were numerous anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations, over 100 of different kinds of steel products. And by the way, Yuki, I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Import Administration, not export. I asked to be export, but they made me import. And so I was involved in some of these steel cases over the years, both as a practitioner and in government. But over 100 cases, industry felt the relief was not great because these were kind of hodgepodge cases, very product specific. So when the President Trump came into office, they went in to see him, the steel industry, which is not shy about asking for relief, and they discussed a 232 proceeding, which they initiated in Trump 1, that found that imports of steel threatened national security, and they imposed 25% duties. Over the years since, there have been exclusions and there were agreements negotiated with certain countries. And so the efficacy of those tariffs really receded over times. And so when President Trump came back to office, he terminated some of these agreements and exclusions and restored the 25% rate across the board and adopted certain other stringent standards to address the issues. And then, as I said, on the 30th of May last week, he announced that the 232 tariffs would be increased to 50% on steel and, by the way, also aluminum, not as germane here, on June 4th. So that's the steel 232 context. Let's flip and do the context on CFIUS. And Sarah, if I can ask you the question, Vanessa, if you can change the slide, please. Um, you know, um, Sarah, the starting point for this is what's the deal? As we all know, that President Biden vetoed the deal. The deal was in court. President Trump took it back. But what is the deal now on the table, and what's the arrangement as best we know?
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Yuki, for having me here today. It's lovely to be able to talk about this live issue and look forward to questions from the audience. So I think we wanted the slides back on, Vanessa, if you don't mind putting them back on. But we can talk about what um, the initial deal was a full acquisition of U.S. Steel for approximately $14 billion and a little bit of change, which was a very good deal, very, very high price. And the question is, apparently now we have a new partnership. The way that the deal is being described has shifted. And so the question is, what does the deal actually look like? And right now, unfortunately, what we can do is read between the lines and speculate a little bit about what is included in this deal because we don't yet have the full details. We know that throughout the process of negotiating with CFIUS, Nippon Steel had made several I don't want to call them concessions, but they had made several amendments or addendums to the deal. Even from the very beginning, Nippon made it clear that U.S. Steel would retain its Pittsburgh headquarters, which is something that is, obviously of great importance, at least from a kind of psychological and perspective, to retain. I'm from Pennsylvania. U.S. Steel looms large in the history of the state. There were also information about how U.S. Nippon was willing to sign a national security agreement that would allow for a majority U.S. directors on the board that could be approved by the U.S. government. We know now as well that there's a commitment that the CEO of U.S. Steel under Nippon will be a U.S. CEO. There's information that's kind of still forthcoming about the degree to which Nippon will not only buy U.S. Steel, but invest more money in capital allocation towards growing the company itself. So in the initial announcement, there was information of a couple $2 billion of modernization into current facilities, as well as potentially expansion of new facilities. There is some information out there that suggests that Nippon has agreed to investments of up to $14 billion, so the same amount as the size of the deal. But we don't have all of the details forthcoming, nor do we know the timeline of those investments or what would happen if some of those investments fell through. Beyond that, there is some information about a national security arrangement, which is a document that is negotiated between CFIUS and the parties to the transaction, that suggests that there will be some amount of restrictions on the ability of Nippon to make its own kind of determinations about things like production levels, and the extent to which they will continue to agree to produce in the U.S. That was a concern from the very early stages of the deal, where some were concerned that Nippon would buy U.S. Steel and then in a few years shift production out of the U.S. into other countries. And Nippon had offered kind of early on in that process to make concessions to the U.S. government to say, we guarantee that we won't do that. And we can talk about sort of from a business perspective, as long as steel tariffs are in place, why it kind of makes commercial sense why Nippon would not move production out of the US, even if it was allowed to do so. And then finally, another aspect of the deal that has been discussed but is light on details is this concept of a golden share. So as far as I can tell, the term golden share became associated with this deal quite recently within the context of an interview that Senator McCormick gave on the deal, in which he said that there was a golden share-like arrangement. Now, in a golden share-like arrangement, which is done frequently in Europe, but not done very often in the US, is that there's normally kind of two components of a golden share arrangement. One is a small equity stake that the government takes in a transaction, and then the second component of that is that the government's ability to make decisions such as board composition is outsized given its equity share. We don't know if the U.S. government is actually taking an equity share in this new partnership. I would be surprised if they actually are. And it would certainly be a very new thing that CFIUS would have been able to negotiate in the context of a mitigation agreement. So I think I covered all of the
Yeah,
details. So back to you, Yuki.
and sure, let me come back on that point on the golden share. So in Europe, the way they work is, as you said, they have a share, they have equity. The government will have a small piece of equity, but there'll usually be certain strategic actions they can veto, right? And it's usually from a security, a supply standpoint in the defense context that these golden shares existed. Companies like BAE and others lived under golden share, and there still are some golden shares in place. And it would be ironic to see a real golden share here, because the U.S. has, as a matter of foreign investment policy, generally been unsupportive of that notion and encouraged countries not to do that kind of thing and not to intervene in that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I guess the one other thing that I just add in here is that oftentimes in Europe, and the reason why Europe has more of these golden share arrangements is because it was a way to kind of have an orderly transfer through the privatization process of, that
Yeah,
these were formally
state
state
owned. Yeah, yeah,
enterprises.
yeah,
And
yeah,
because of that, there was a kind of concern from a strategic perspective of handing all of the decision-making authority over to private actors. And so that's kind of that's the historic reason why Europe has more of these golden shares.
for sure. Okay, so we could take the slides off now, I think, and that's a good segue into a discussion. So Sarah, on the CFIUS case, as I said, President Biden vetoed the deal. President Trump resurrected it effectively. He didn't have to, but he did. I mean, the threshold question here is there a national security threat? I mean, national security, CFIUS, as everyone knows, or not everyone maybe, but it usually in practice by CFIUS, it looks at the threats posed by the foreign buyer in its home country and the vulnerability of the U.S. asset being acquired, and what would happen if the foreign owner denied the U.S. government access to the resources of that entity during an exigency, for example. What's your take on that issue as a starting point here?
Yeah, well, certainly kind of how we have typically and historically thought of what constitutes national security, it's very hard to see a national security risk arising from this particular transaction. Um, I know, Jeff, that you've done a lot of looking specifically at the U.S. steel industry for your work on anti-dumping cases, and I don't want to kind of tread over your figures on the share of the defense industrial base that U.S. Steel provides, but it's very, very small. Um, and so we cannot kind of make a serious claim to a concern about the defense industrial base when it comes to U.S. Steel. And instead, what it seems that the concern is, stemming from both the Biden administration and then also in the Trump administration, is a sense that there is a national security rationale to ensure that the U.S. steel industry as a whole is robust, and that there is concern in the context of Nippon buying U.S. steel that somehow, even though Nippon Steel would continue to produce in the U.S. and therefore contribute to the U.S. steel industry, that the mere fact of foreign ownership in this industry would constitute some kind of national security risk that needed to be mitigated. And that type of rationale is quite different from the kinds of rationale that we've really kind of understood to be clear national security concerns in the past.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And what you're alluding to is, so yeah, I mean, when I look at this, I see, Japan's a close ally of the United States. Nippon has been a steward of assets in the United States, a good steward of assets in the United States. The data you alluded to, in the prior 232 cases, there was one around the turn of the century, around 2000, that said the domestic steel, only 0.2% of domestic steel output went to defense in the United States. The more recent 232 under the Trump administration said 2% of U.S. steel U.S. steel output was used for defense. Take your pick, all right? The fact is, very little steel is used for for defense purposes. And by the way, U.S. Steel was not selling steel to the Defense Department. Specialty steels were being bought by other companies. Okay, so and look, U.S. Steel is the third largest steel producer in the United States today, not the largest anymore. Perhaps sadly, if you look at this historically. So it's really hard to see, as you say, even in an exigency, if they said, we're going to shut down U.S. Steel, it's hard to see it's going to have any impact. Okay, maybe a little raised prices or something, but it's hard to see it's going to have any national security impact. But I think when you talked about national security before and the national security importance of having a robust steel industry, to me that reads more in national economic security. You agree with that?
Yes, I do. And I think that this is, we're living in a time in which the boundaries of what constitutes national security and national economic security are blurring in ways that make it very hard to retain that clean separation between the two. Of course, very famously, the first Trump administration's national security strategy boldly declared that economic security is national security. And of course, that's true that one of the important things about being able to defend yourself is that you need to have a strong economy to do so. And so, of course, national economic strength is directly related to your security. But the question is, once we start going down that road of thinking about economic security and national security being kind of so closely intertwined that we can't distinguish between the two, then it becomes a question of how much can you have an open economy while also, if you're concerned about security. And if you believe with evidence that having an open economy leads to economic growth and prosperity, then actually you could make an argument that being too closed to having too closed of an economy could be a national security threat, because you are reducing your ability to grow and have a growth-oriented and dynamic economy. I'll just also very quickly, if I may, turn specifically to, because this can get just very sort of like, let's argue over first principles. But if we look at the executive order that was that the Biden administration issued back in 2022 that provided more information on how CFIUS should evaluate national security concerns, there's a section in there that I think is the most relevant to this particular case. And what it says is the committee shall consider as appropriate the United States capability with respect to manufacturing capabilities, services, critical mineral resources, or technologies. The degree of diversification through alternative suppliers across the supply chain, including suppliers located in allied or partner economies. And so for me, when we read what was this particular EO that was trying to think about how do we evaluate concerns over security of supply, even in that EO, it was clear that if you have a variety of supply, also from importers, and that where you're importing from are allies and partners of the U.S., then that is considered a positive for national security, not a negative.
And I agree with that, and I think that's a good point. And there has been an evolution of the standard. If you go back to Trump 1, and the 232 case on steel, that was really the beginning of the inflection point, I would say, in terms of looking at differently at what was national security. Because there's no doubt, as I said, when they looked at whether imports threatened to impair national security, they basically found, even if imports eroded the U.S. production base, it's not going to matter because it's so little of it's used for defense. And so in the models they looked at in 232 historically for what's a threat to national security, they would look at an input-output model of the economy in an exigency. And the reality is imports weren't doing much. So they broadened it out, and that standard there was very focused on the economics and the economic security. And now we've that's followed into CFIUS, if you will, on that. What I would say about steel, just by way of a contextual point, there is a steel trade problem in the world, to be sure. Okay, it's existed for quite a while, and the industry was right to come in and try to get relief because fundamentally there is overcapacity in steel production in the world. Most of it's in China. And the dilemma, and we don't import much from China. And so the dilemma is how you remedy that. But what does happen is the Chinese overproduction, because it's a global steel market, it affects the pricing, right? In the perfect world, you'd probably have some supply arrangement in place. People agree to close in supply, but that's probably pretty unrealistic. And so 232 is a crude tool maybe to address, what is a legitimate steel trade issue, but not necessarily a national security issue. Okay, and I think that's the context point. Let's come back for a minute to Nippon, the steel deal on the partnership concept, and let me ask you what do you think that's about? But I just want to make one more point, which is that on the Nippon deal, which is that look, I'll give President Trump credit here because President Biden declared this deal dead, as we all said, with no basis in national security, based on with a divided cabinet, right? Okay, based on some view of what the world should have looked like in steel. I don't know exactly what motivated him, but something like that. And President Trump could have let that decision stick, let them go to the courts, and the U.S. government probably would have won, and the deal could have been killed. So credit President Trump for bringing back a deal that, really their arguendo is really no national security basis to stop, right? And now they say there's going to be a partnership. What do you make of that?
I think the partnership is just PR, right? It's spin. Unless we get real information that the structure of the deal has changed, it's still an acquisition. And you can argue, well, anytime that a foreign investor is investing in the US, it's a partnership. It's a partnership with the US because the foreign investor wants to participate in our economy, and that's good, right? Like that's a good thing, right? But I don't think that this is a partnership in the way that we kind of generally
Right.
think of what a partnership means when we're talking about commercial transactions. And I guess what I would just also add in here is that, yes, I have argued for a long time that this deal on balance is good for the U.S. And actually is beneficial to national security as opposed to a threat to it. But also that because it's not a national security threat, it's wrong for CFIUS. If we want CFIUS to be a robust, fact-based process, that we need to be sure to not allow it to expand into areas that it's not meant to be operating within. And so, yes, it's good to have a transaction that should have gone through from the beginning go through. But we also have to pay attention to mitigation terms as well, because CFIUS is not supposed to impose mitigation terms on a transaction unless it finds a national security risk to the transaction, right? And what I worry about is that, I also study I study CFIUS, but I also study investment screening in a comparative perspective. And what we're seeing, different countries use their investment screening mechanisms for very different purposes, even if they're all supposed to be kind of tied to national security. And a good example of this is the French case. And if you go to any kind of investment screening event in the EU, you're gonna get the French and the Germans. And when you get them in the room together, you'll see just how you can take an investment screening mechanism and do totally different things with it. Because the Germans have a very similar kind of setup to the US in that they really they don't mitigate very much. They try to stay out of transactions unless they actually need to intervene in some way. And the French, especially since 2014, and there was a minister named Montborg who is like very, very focused on kind of expanding investment screening. They mitigate almost like 50% of transactions. And I've been in rooms with people on that side that will say like, yeah, well, the investment screening like gives us an opportunity to kind of get our hands into the deal and put in terms that we want for more industrial policy purposes uh, rather than for protecting national security. And I don't think that that is good for the U.S. in the long term. And I also don't think that that's what the legislation, the CFIUS legislation, FIRMA and FINSA before it, that's not what this was trying to do.
Sure. And a couple of things. One is, look, I guess my view of the word partnership, this is not a partnership under Delaware law. If they want to call it a duck, because calling it a duck allows them to authorize it, I'm not going to stand in the way of that. And I think that's what this is here, point one. Point two, Senator McCormick, as you say, was the one who laid out what he said are the conditions of an NSA. And there are NSAs where they have board members and whatnot. And so it would be traditional, it would be consistent with the traditional national security agreements for mitigating risk to have some appointments of board members who would protect U.S. national interests. Here it sounds like the board may be predominantly U.S. I'm not sure I'm aware of another NSA that does that, okay? Whether the NSA has standards, I'm skeptical that it actually will say, things like you can't lay off people, you can't do this. I think the idea is that the board appointees would protect those interests, and maybe there's some service to that in the end. Well, we won't see the NSA, presumably. It's not going to be made public, I don't believe. Okay, so we won't know. Most of them aren't. Okay, now maybe this one will, but that would be very unusual. I mean, I have a drawer full of some that I've been working on clients with over the years, and none of them are out there. Okay, and some of them were somewhat controversial. So I doubt we'll see it. Okay, but I think it's not uncommon to have a structure like that. And indeed, for classified companies, there's a very established mitigation mechanism to mitigate risk, where there's 3 outside directors who are appointed with the approval of the U.S. government. The foreign guy appoints them. And I do think you'll see that here. So I think, again, I agree with you. I think partnership is spin, but you'll see something along the lines of a traditional mitigation agreement. How much of that gets out remains to be seen. Maybe there'll be hearings that will come out. It'll be very interesting. One comment on the foreign situation. Look, Europe has put in place these screening mechanisms over the recent years, including particularly since the pandemic. The reality was the environment in Europe to U.S. acquisitions of assets in defense and aerospace was always pretty closed before they ever had screening mechanisms. And they did it through golden shares, and they just did it through osmosis, and they told companies you can't invest. So this was a way of regularizing it. But yes, there's different views and concepts, and you do see areas of economic security coming in. And again, the United States has historically, in the context of negotiating bilateral investment treaties and bilateral investment party, railed against all of that. Okay, and so here we are. And I guess the question for CFIUS practice is, this is an unusual case. And unusual cases get complicated. We had Dubai ports. We've had a couple others like this. And, is this going to lead to the standard on national interest? broader across the board, or was this an outlier case? Okay, and because it's a high profile case, because the president's involved in it, which, presidential involvement in CFIUS cases is pretty limited, a couple per presidency generally, where they really are personally involved. I've been in one or two where they have been, not much. Do you think this is an outlier, or do you think this is shifting sands?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Early on, I really, in this process, I really emphasize that this is an outlier. There are things that are very specific to U.S. Steel from a symbolic perspective. This was going on during the context of a tough-fought presidential race where the headquarters of U.S. Steel is in a swing state, but also it's not just that that's where the headquarters is. It's that U.S. Steel is a very important historic and cultural entity, right? So the optics of it being bought by a foreign company in the context of a presidential year were just really bad, and probably, Nippon might have just waited a little while to try to do this deal, and it could have gone through without so much fanfare. So I'm hopeful that this is a one-off and that we shouldn't overlearn from this particular transaction because it is so sui generis. But I do think that we have to be careful to ensure that this is a one-off, right? Because when politicians and bureaucrats get access to powerful tools and realize how powerful they are, they like to use them again and again. And so that's why I think it's really important to try to ensure that that mitigation is not something that can just be thrown around every time that there is a transaction before the committee, that there are standards that have to be met before you can start talking about mitigation. And those standards are that you have to first show that there is a legitimate national security risk arising from the transaction in order to justify putting in a national security agreement that is designed to mitigate those particular risks.
Right. In other words, you can argue here that the mitigation is not of national security risks. It's of some level of national economic risks and interests, right? I would also note when you drive to Scranton, there's the Joe Biden Parkway you see, and I think that kind of plays into the whole attitude toward, what happened here. I mean, the other question here is, what are the consequences of, both the last two presidents have focused on industrial policy. President Biden, the CHIPS Act, investment. President Trump views tariffs as a means of encouraging domestic production at home, right? And what do you think, what do you think of the consequences of this deal, if any, for industrial policy in steel? Maybe that's an unfair question. You're not an economist, but I'll ask it anyway.
Yeah, well, it's certainly, I think, there's a reason why, in the context of this deal, that President Trump announced that he was doubling tariffs on steel, right? That, I mean, we know from if you study foreign direct investment in a historical perspective, you know that foreign direct investment from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they were all what we call tariff hopping. FDI, right? That in the context of high tariffs, if you want to be able to serve a market, you need to you need to invest in that market so that you can produce domestically and therefore avoid the tariffs. And that's the thing that's kind of odd to me about how this transaction became so controversial. And we saw senators writing open letters to CFIUS about how, that somehow Nippon was trying to kind of get around steel tariffs by doing this. This is actually an indication that the tariffs were working, right? And by that they were creating a business rationale for foreign firms to bring their money and their technology to the U.S. and to revitalize an industry that has kind of in some ways has needed a shot in the arm when it comes to upgrading facilities and transferring the latest generation technology. But what that does mean is that tariffs are probably going to be, the longer the tariffs stay around and the longer that companies are making capital allocation decisions on the basis of those tariffs. That also means that the tariffs are likely getting stickier and stickier because now you're in a situation that if you remove them, you may kind of undercut the business rationale for those investments being made in the first place.
That's very helpful context. Let me add a little data to this discussion. So when President Trump imposed duties on steel and Trump won, the ITC issued a full report on this. And what it showed, the most clear consequence of what happened is if a steel tonnage was, and this is a fake number, $100 a ton, if steel imports, the duty imposed was 25%. If that meant steel imports prices would raise, to let's say $100 a ton, and that's a fake number, what happened to domestic prices? Well, domestic prices went up to 95 in effect. All right, because the domestic steel producers said, all right, we have the protection of this higher price of imports, so we're going to bring our prices not all the way up, but somewhat up. What the record doesn't show, there's some limited increased investment, okay, in the period in the steel industry, maybe on expanding plants, but the record doesn't show much evidence that that industrial policy led to a lot more investment. Indeed, what happened is as the tariffs became less effective over the years through exclusions and agreements, both of these effects largely went away. It's I'll put my former defense industrial hat on from the Pentagon and say I'm not aware of an industry that's been reshored, okay, that was offshore. There's this guy called Ricardo who did a little economics on comparative advantage. And call me a skeptic on the industrial policy side for either of these presidents and the efficacy of doing some of those things. So, Yuki, you have some questions? You got to put your mic on first. That would help.
I didn't wanna disturb with any background noise, but yes, we do have a couple of audience questions. So this actually has a lot of relevance to what Sarah was talking about what CFIUS is supposed to do and what's not supposed to do. The first audience question that I can give you and have either of you respond really is, can you explain what the role, if any, CFIUS has played between the decision made by former President Biden back in the January 2025 and President Trump's decision more recently? What are the legal options for a case to be reopened and CFIUS reassessing, renegotiating a case?
You want to handle it, Sarah? Or,
Yeah. So CFIUS was very much involved. So President Trump basically ordered CFIUS to review the transaction. And so that was done, and it was through the context of that CFIUS process that that Trump then, well, at some point kind of probably got a little bit outside of the normal the normal procedure as he normally does. But there was that process, and there was reporting in the news that said that the committee was still gave the president a split decision. I don't know anything more about that other than that it was reported. I saw it at least in one article. But in terms of the kind of broader question of through what authority can CFIUS review a case that has already had a decision handed down? I mean, this is not the normal way of doing things. I am unaware of a previous instance in which a determination was made and then kind of rescinded and go back to the drawing board. Um, and it happened, and so I guess it's legal. But I do think that I do think that raises a question of, the efficacy of CFIUS when it does block and when it does mitigate. Because if you see that there's some light between what is happening in CFIUS this first round and what might happen in a future round, it gives corporations a reason to fight a little bit harder and to maybe not view CFIUS as such a scary entity as perhaps they thought of in the past. But Jeff, I'd love to hear your view on
So,
this.
well, I think that the key is that there was a lawsuit. So a lawsuit was filed challenging. President Biden made a final determination, right? But it was challenged in the courts. And so the administration, in the context of the litigation, had the ability to take it back, if you will. Okay. I think the lawsuit gave them the color and imprimatur of authority to do that, right? Because you could argue that the first one was closed, but it was stayed. And even Biden, before he left office, I think stayed the effect of it, as I recall, to allow for the litigation he knew would happen. Okay. And so I think that allowed, as a process matter, that allowed it. What I would say also is, and you alluded to, in the Biden administration, CFIUS is typically a consensual process. In like 99 out of 100 cases, there's a consensus and they make a decision and it goes to the president. Sometimes, most of the time, it doesn't go to the president because CFIUS will decide there's no national security problem in most cases, or the few that there are one, they go to the president. Or even if there is a national security problem, what happens is CFIUS calls the country up involved and says, hey, we're going to tell the president to disapprove this. And typically the case is withdrawn. That's typically what happens. Here, of course, it's very high profile. People weren't going to do that. And so, the funny thing was, it was USTR who had issues with the case, not the Defense Department, right? Trump came along, said, let's take it back. We'll do it de novo. And, by all accounts, CFIUS looked at it again. I didn't hear, that's interesting, that it's split vote again. It wouldn't surprise me. But I don't think it's contestable. I don't think I think it'd be hard to contest the process here for what they did. Yuki, do you have another question?
Yes, I actually have three more if we have time to
Wow,
get through
sure.
them. We'll try to get through as many. Next question is, there are speculations saying that if the U.S. Steel is to issue a golden share to the U.S. government. So here we go back again to the discussion of a golden share. It likely is to be delisted from the New York tradings, as listing companies are generally not permitted to issue golden share in the United States. Is
Wow.
it accurate based on your knowledge? And if it's likely to happen, what are the implications?
Now that's interesting. I don't, that one, I am not aware of the answer to that. I will say I am aware of European publicly traded companies where there are golden shares. So not all shares are listed. In other words, you do have situations where there's mixed situations where some shares are not listed and some other shares are. So I don't know in the context of the US stock exchange rules what the answer to that is. That's a good question. Okay, but I am aware, in a lot of foreign countries, liquidity in capital markets is not like it is here, right? So typically foreign companies will list, but some of the shares are not publicly listed, okay? Particularly founder shares, right? And so you see this kind of thing all the time. So I'm quite sure there's golden shares in the context of publicly listed companies. Sarah, do you have any comment on that one?
That is not something that I feel confident providing my opinion on. It's a great question and a good reminder that, the more that the government starts to kind of embark on industrial policy, it needs to kind of think about to what extent does the legal structures that is working within, like to what extent are those compatible with what they're trying to do. and it may require some changes, but I don't know. I will say though that I really, really would be surprised if the US government is taking an equity position in US Steel. I think, that a golden share sounds fantastic, so why not call it that? But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's happening.
Yeah, the only back during the financial crisis, when we were saving the automotive industry, the U.S. government took some kind of stake in the way of warrants, I believe, which is a certain kind of security in the auto companies at the time. And those were publicly traded companies. Those were big publicly traded companies. I think the issues that the questioner is talking about, maybe these are the rules of the exchanges, and I just don't know whether the U.S. exchanges have. I'm not even sure it's a securities law rule. I think it's a question of the rules of the New York Stock Exchange or the Nasdaq, and when they list things. I don't know the answer to that directly either in the United States. Next,
So,
Yuki.
yes. So next, let me take it to a little bit different direction. We spent a bulk majority of time up to now kind of dissecting what the deal would look like, more of a legal aspect of it, more regulatory aspect of it. Let me get at you for more of a optics, a political side of this question. First, one of such question comes in from a participant asked about how do you feel, what do you think about the PR aspect of it that was presented both by U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel? Have Could they have done a better job packaging and articulating what they're trying to do to the public, namely those who are likely to be affected in the Pennsylvania, including Pittsburgh and other places across the country where U.S. Steel has its mills.
Sarah, you want to take that one?
Sure. Also, just to clean up on the previous question, Embrar has the Brazilian government has a golden share in Embrar, and Embrar is able to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So I think there are ways
To
to
do
get
it,
around.
yeah.
Yeah. In terms of the optics, yes, I mean, I think that the reality is that we are in a different world than we were in 7, 10 years ago, and that corporations, when they're embarking on major cross-border acquisitions, particularly in industries that hold symbolic meaning in some way, and particularly when the investments are going to um, affect a important constituency, that they need to be more thoughtful about how to engage. My understanding is that one of the reasons why the union became so against the transaction early on is that they felt that in the early kind of stages of the negotiations that Nippon was not kind of as engaged with the union as the union wanted them to be, and that Nippon said, well, like we kind of couldn't, we had to wait to engage with the unions and things like that. And so I think, kind of better understanding the political context that you're jumping into is going to be super important here. And we may kind of worry about kind of what does that mean for the global economy that so quickly these kind of political machinations can bring down a transaction or extend it for a really long time. But that's the reality, and that's what I would really impress upon a corporation that was contemplating a major transaction in the US right before a presidential election. Maybe think through what enemies you're going to create, and
Yeah.
how do you get more of the not just the shareholders but the stakeholders on your side.
Sure. And I think, look, Nippon Steel got caught in this situation where U.S. Steel put itself for sale, and they had a process, right? And that process, the timing of it, as you say, worked out oddly. What I always tell clients and prospective clients is the number one factor that makes CFIUS cases hard is if there's an opposition, right? And here you had a disappointed bidder, okay, who, and the union who, would they have, I take what you say, and the union said that, but in the end of the day, would the union have come out differently? I'm not sure. They looked at Nippon's track record on dealing with unionized employees, and they had a view, and they were maybe buttressed in it by the view of President Biden out there from early on in this, right, to not come to deal. Because Nippon certainly did try to negotiate some resolution with the unions, and they wouldn't do it, right? So they tried, right? But the number one factor, 99 out of 100 of these cases, you don't have this, right? Most of these cases aren't contested and the people go away. But if you have a disappointed bidder or someone and they go to the hill, that's when things happen, right? And that's here the context was way broader than that. Okay, but I think that's the reality of it. Yuki, anything else, or are we almost?
So there is actually a little bit of a broader question about this what this could mean moving forward. So, for example, in the rally speech in Pittsburgh, President Trump has taken credit for this quote unquote partnership that we spent last hour discussing, saying that it was a deal directly resulted from his tariff policy. And as you mentioned, Jeff, in the outset, in the same speech, in the latter half of the speech, he talked extensively about this raise the tariff rate on steel and aluminum from the current 25 to 50. So what are you thinking? What do you think about this claim that, oh, because of this decision was imminent, that's what he seems to suggest, that the company who tries to avoid that could make these, could go to these kind of deals.
Sarah?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that, there are like kind of two things here to think about. One is that for a long time, CFIUS really functioned as a method of last resort and guardrails, right? So the idea was, and this is encoded in every single, in both FIRMA, in FINSA, in every single document that is associated with CFIUS. The document starts off with a preamble that says the U.S. is an open economy to investment, and we need to protect kind of this narrow national security sliver, right? We have over time seen that this narrowness has expanded. And it has expanded not just with respect to investment screening, but it has expanded with the use of tariffs and the use of and other forms of industrial policy, like different forms of subsidies. And so we are in an era in which the government is now trying to manage the economy in a more active way than it has in the past. We can also put export controls on the table with this as well. And that even if you try to scope things very narrowly, the more that there is this kind of idea to manage the economy, the more you're going to see that all of these different aspects of macroeconomic management are going to interact with each other and are going to demand that, if you're going to subsidize chip production in the US, then you're going to put in place more restrictions on who gets to own those things, right? Because if you're using US taxpayer money to do that, you're going to make sure that US taxpayers and US firms are the beneficiaries of this. And so these things work together. And so we can start narrow, but they have a tendency to expand. And then that relates to that second point, which is that all of these actions place a lot more authority in the hands of bureaucrats and politicians who will find that there are ways in which, once they have these authorities at their fingertips, that these can be used to deliver on politics. And that, again, also means that you're going to see more and more of this unless there's a movement to try to put more guardrails on the use of these tools.
Let me just add as a final thought here. Look, I mean, when you look at FDI and you look at the use of CFIUS by the last two administrations, and I have the data, you see, the truth is there's very few cases go to mitigation every year. Very few cases are withdrawn. We do still have in foreign investment, by and large, an open economy. And as I said before, if you have to call it a duck to get there in a hard case, I'm okay with that, although I'd prefer not to go there. But I do think in foreign investment land anyway, we have yet to see, other than in the really hard case, a change. Sure, national security's changed. We look at different factors than we used to years ago. We look at exploitation of personal information. We look at other kinds of security risks that are real security risks. But I do think that's the case. The irony here is maybe for Nippon, by putting the tariffs in place, he's benefited Nippon too, because U.S. Steel is going to be able to make more money because they're going to have the favoritism of, the tariff wheel. So ironically, maybe Nippon's more willing to invest more money because with higher tariffs, they get more out of it, and it's a win-win.
Right.
Yuki,
On that note, thank you both for shedding a great light into what has been quite murky since his initial announcement about 10 days ago. But and then thank you for everyone who joined us on this such a short notice, and very insightful questions as well. This concludes this webinar, and thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of the day.
thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.